Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for coming. I'm happy to be back at the Fondazione Merz. Beatrice. Thank you again. I have beautiful memories of my exhibition here. That's become maybe my most important solo project. And I'm thrilled to be back. I also want to thank Claudia Gioia, who was the curator of that show. Thank you again, Claudia. And thank you, Danilo, for inviting me for this conversation. How do we make art when the world is in such a state? I don't know. And that is why I'm an artist. The definition of art that I've always liked the most is by a Nigerian writer named Chinua Achebe. And Achebe said that art is our attempt to change the order of reality that was given to us. Imagine that. To change the order of reality that was given to us. How do we do that? I don't know. And that is why I'm an artist. To try to answer this question. And every project of mine starts with those questions. How do I change the order of reality that was given to me and to us? Now, I'm an artist, but I'm really an architect. I never studied art. I'm an architect that makes art. And for an architect, context is everything. And so I react to the context. I have never done a single work of art in my entire career that is just pure product of my imagination. I don't know how to do that. And I admire artists that look at a canvas or a piece of paper or some material and do something out of nothing. I don't know how to do that. I'm an architect. I respond to the context. And before acting in this context, I need to understand. So my modus operandi has always been the same. I will not act in the world before understanding the world. I repeat, I will not act in the world before understanding the world. So I will share with you a few things, and then we can have a conversation later. So I ask you to please turn off your phones. Please turn off your phones completely. And I ask you to be very patient. My lecture will last 6 hours and 33 minutes. Can we have the lights off, please? Completely off. Thank you. How can I start a lecture today and ignoring the context in which we are? It's the unthinkable happening right here in Europe. War in Europe. No one knows what's going to happen. And so there is little what we can say. We just can express our horror to what's happening. And of course, when I woke up this morning with this news, I immediately thought about a work of mine that is being shown right now at the GAM in Torino. And it's an extraordinary image of Lucio Fontana that came back from Argentina after the war in 1946, and he visited his studio in Milan. When I discovered that image a long time ago, I immediately contacted the publisher and the owner of the copyrights of this image, and I purchased the copyright. I thought it was one of the most extraordinary images in the history of contemporary art. Because this is the moment when Italy had lost the war, and Italy was on its knees. And what happened? In less than 15 years, Italy was reborn. It was the most extraordinary process of renaissance, rebirth, thanks to artists and intellectuals, thanks to culture. And Fontana was just one of those artists that resisted the effect of the war and decided to create, to live, to create as an act of resistance, as an act of hope. Of course, besides Fontana, we have Burri, and so many others. Scarpita. Until we reach Manzoni, and then he was the bridge towards the magnificent Arte Povera group. This was happening just a few years after the end of the war, with Italy completely destroyed. This is the power of culture. And of course, it was not only in the visual arts, it was in the film world. Rossellini with this masterpiece, and of course Visconti and Vittorio De Sica. And then Fellini came up. And then one of my favorite filmmakers, Antonioni. And here again comes Pasolini. And Pasolini, as you know, was not only a filmmaker, he was a poet, a writer, a critic, a polemicist, someone that spoke every day the truth about Italy and Europe. He is my model of intellectual that I want to be. And then from Pasolini, we move on to, obviously, Bertolucci, who is the bridge also towards contemporary Italian cinema. And of course, for example, in Conformista was based on the Moravia book. So the same rebirth was happening in literature, from Moravia to, of course, Ungaretti and Pavese. When I think about that period of history, this is what I think about. M'illumino d'immenso. This beautiful poem by Ungaretti. So this is the context in which we find ourselves today. A war is starting and we don't know what's going to happen. But I hope artists and politicians will have the imagination to survive this new war, because only imagination and creativity can save us. The other context in which we find ourselves, of course, is COVID. And it's an irony that when we thought COVID was about to disappear, then we start a new war. There is so much I could say about COVID, but I just want to say one thing. Sadly, we live under a system of apartheid, where the wealthy countries have more vaccines than what they need. And the less developed countries, the countries in developing, the poorer countries, have no access to vaccine. Today, more than 130 countries still do not have access to a vaccine. I think this is intolerable and unacceptable. During the confinement, I accumulated extraordinary images of the pain caused by COVID around the world. This is one of the most extraordinary images of pain I saw during the COVID crisis. This is a family in the Amazon in Brazil. And here they're all surrounding the father who has died of COVID. This is the context in which we find ourselves. So, of course, arises the question, how can culture affect change? This is a terrible image of South Africa. Most of Africa still does not have the vaccine. And as you know, the major pharmaceutical companies have refused to release the copyright. So these countries cannot fabricate, cannot produce a vaccine. And so they have to wait for their turn, and they have to pay for the vaccines. In Europe, the European Union pays 2 euros per vaccine to the big pharmaceutical companies like Moderna or Pfizer. South Africa, Uganda, they pay 8 euros per vaccine. It's totally unacceptable. Right now, I'm going to take you to Cape Town in South Africa. Cape Town is a very beautiful city. It's a port city. It's a very cool city. But let me show you a small lab called African. African, it's a small lab run mostly by women. And they're trying to develop the vaccine from scratch because the pharmaceutical companies will not help them. So their last project, because they could not develop the vaccine, was to try to replicate the Moderna vaccine. So they analyzed the existing Moderna vaccine and they tried to replicate it. Can you imagine? Because they don't have the formula. This is the explanation. South Africa set up a hub to begin developing mRNA vaccines, where scientists, with the backing of the World Health Organization, are trying to reverse engineer the Moderna vaccine from scratch because the US drug maker won't share its technology. Please listen clearly to that phrase, are trying to reverse engineer. Imagine, they could produce a vaccine if they had the formula. This reverse engineering will take at least 2 years because Pfizer and Moderna will not give them the formula. So in the meantime, people dies. When I read stories like this, I'm ashamed of being a human being. This is Karen. She's the technical director, and she's the one directing this project to reverse engineer the COVID vaccine for Africa. So these are the two things that are in my mind regarding the context in which we live now. The war that is just started and COVID. I'm going to share now with you a few projects, some recent and some not so recent. When I get mad at what's happening around me, I put this sandwich board and I walk around the cities and I preach to people and ask them to teach me to outgrow our madness. This is a phrase from Kenzaburo Oe, the Nobel Prize in Literature. He's Japanese. And it's the title of a book where he speaks to his son and suggests that his generation, the father's generation, has failed. And he's asking the new generation, the generation of his son, to help him to outgrow his madness. And that's how I feel. When I feel impotent, I put these sandwich boards and I walk around the city and start yelling like a preacher. Teach me to outgrow our madness. This is how I feel with a new war starting in Europe. Every year, on August 6, at 8:15 in the morning, Japan commemorates the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On March 11, 2011, the nuclear nightmare returned to Japan. That day, at 2 p.m. and 46 minutes and 23 seconds, there was an earthquake It was 9 on the Richter scale. It lasted 6 minutes. The waves from the tsunami that came right after the earthquake were 40 meters high. 15,833 people were killed instantly. 2,667 were wounded. And 6,145 people disappeared. From that moment, the word Fukushima entered the vocabulary of nuclear tragedies, similar to Hiroshima or Nagasaki. This is the Fukushima 4 nuclear reactors. And when the tsunami hit, one of them started leaking 350 tons of nuclear reactive water into the system of Fukushima. These engineers are trying to find where is the leak to stop it. Outside, the radioactivity level is 1,000% higher than normal. And after the quake, the tsunami hit Fukushima. I was invited by the city of Fukushima to create a memorial for the victims. I went many times to understand before acting. One day, I discovered this structure that was completely destroyed, but the structure was still up. And I was told that this was a small radio station. And from here, a young woman announced to the people of Fukushima to please run to the mountain because the tsunami is coming in less than 5 minutes. Run to the mountain, run to the mountain. She wanted to save as many people as possible, so she stayed there too long, and she died right here, but managed to save more than 25,000 people who heard her voice in the radio. So when I came, the community had created a small memorial for her in her homage, and the government didn't know what to do with this building. The antennas from which her voice told to the people, "Get out, go to the mountain, were still up. Her name was Miki Endo, and she was a hero, the hero of Fukushima. I spent days and days looking around, trying to understand the complexity of the tragedy. I spoke with politicians, with scientists, with journalists, with intellectuals, with writers. I needed to understand, why does Japan still use nuclear power in spite of the fact that you had 2 nuclear tragedies? I visited 3 refugee camps that were set up by the government very quickly to house more than 15,000 people that were left without homes. So the government was quite efficient at the beginning. When I was walking in between these containers that became homes, I was moved, touched by these little signs of people trying to recreate what they lost. Little gardens, fruits, vegetables, flowers. They had lost everything. But the solitude of the people using the refugee camp was unbearable. I found photographs everywhere on the floor that were deteriorating because of the water. Photographs of people that I don't know and I will never know. I don't even know if they are alive. And memorials. Memorials everywhere. Little memorials, spontaneous memorials for the loved one that were gone. The main newspaper of Fukushima was destroyed in the tsunami. But the journalists wanted to keep working, wanted to keep the community together. So they started writing their news in these big sheets of paper in a small office that they opened immediately after the tsunami. And they put them outside in the streets, telling the news to the community. This is what's happening today. Today, if you visit the new offices, you will see these large sheets of news framed as a memory of that fatal day. This one is particularly moving. These are the names of the places and communities around Fukushima, and these are the numbers of disappeared people that day. And no one knew about them at that moment. One day, I visited a school that had been destroyed by the tsunami. And I learned that many students, young students, aged between 12 and 15, had died in the tsunami. They did not escape on time. I was very moved by that story, and I returned the next morning to the school, and I wanted to be there alone. And then, in the middle of the silence and the solitude, I realized that inside the former classrooms, there were still some blackboards hanging on the walls. And I thought, how many hours do these students who died spent looking at these blackboards? And I calculated, according to their age and when they started school, that they had spent 15,000 hours of their lives looking at these blackboards. And I thought, these blackboards, they are precious. They contain the gaze of these students who died. This is how they learned about the world. And that's when I decided to work the memorial from the idea of the blackboards. I titled the work Umashimenkana, which is the title of a poem by Sadako Kurihara, a marvelous poet and activist. She's a woman who died a few years ago. And Sadako was living in Hiroshima when the nuclear bomb fell, but she survived. And that same night, her neighbor, a young woman, gave birth to a child. So Sadako helped her to give birth to her child. And after the child was born, she went back to her home, exhausted, crying, and she wrote this poem, Umashimenkana. It's an old Japanese word that means we shall bring forth new life. So the idea was that even in the middle of the horror, you have to keep fighting and bring back life. So I dedicated the memorial to her and to the children of Ichinomaki, which is a school. So the first thing I did, I invited a well-known calligrapher from Fukushima, and I asked him to write this extraordinary word, Umashimenkana, on a black canvas. I wanted to see what it looks like in Japanese. Umashimenkana, we shall bring forth new life. For the memorial, I was able to obtain 12 blackboards from the school. And I asked permission to the parents of the kids who died if I could use the blackboards. They said yes, but please make sure that there are no writings from our childs on the blackboards. So I photographed the blackboards first, and then I erased the blackboards according to their will. I was given a very large dark space, and we installed the blackboards with just a little light. The blackboards that receive 15,000 hours of the gaze of the students who died. This is where they put their hopes, their dreams about the world. The billboards that took 15,000 hours of the gaze of the children who died. Every 3 minutes, this is what we did. We projected on each blackboard the word Umashimenkana written by a student of the same age of those who died. And after a few seconds, the word would disappear. And we did this every 3 minutes. Uma shimenkana. We shall bring forth new life. In visiting the school, I had found some chalk on the floor. The chalk that was used to write on these blackboards. So I decided to create a sculpture in the middle of the space. I fabricated a little box with plexiglass that measures 3 meters by 3 meters by 5 centimeters tall. And we filled it with the chalk. I wanted to create a space of color, of creativity, a space of life in the middle of the space. Uma Shimenkana in Fukushima, Japan. This is Canada, in Montreal. This is the center of the city. And if you walk towards the south, you will find the cathedral. And the Cathedral of Montreal is the border between the new and the old Montreal. The old Montreal is an area with a lot of pedestrian streets, with a lot of boutiques, cafes, and restaurants. It's very touristic. I was invited by the city to do a public intervention in this building called the cupola. The cupola was the siege of the Canadian Parliament, but it burned. So it was rebuilt because it's a national monument, and it burned again. And again, and again. It burned 5 times in its history. So after the 5th fire, the Canadian Parliament moved to another building. But they kept the monument empty. And they invited me and asked me what could I do inside this monument. It's 9 floors tall, and it can be seen from around 6 blocks all around. Here I went to the roof of the church, which is 100 meters away, and I wanted to see the visibility of these cupola and of those windows from the rest of the city. So I realized it has high visibility. I went 7 times to Montreal, trips of 3 days, 5 days, a week, 10 days. I was trying to understand the city and trying to understand the essence of this place. And I couldn't find anything. The more I read, the more I talked to people, there was nothing. There was no issue I could understand and focus on. But one day, I was walking towards the cupola, and I observed a little truck on the right side, and I saw 3 men taking out boxes of food and vegetable out of the truck and delivering to the building. But the building had no sign. I didn't think it was a hotel or hospital or school, anything, so I was curious. So I approached the van. And the van had this text that says, "Together it is possible to alleviate hunger." So I looked for the entrance to this nondescript building, and I finally found a very modest, invisible sign that said Accueil Bono. I ring the bell, and I discover it was a homeless shelter, a place where they welcome 1,500 people every month, and they give them breakfast, lunch, and dinner without asking any questions. I spoke with the director of the Accueil Bono, and she told me there are 2 more homeless shelters in the area, and she gave me the address. I had not seen them. They were very discreet. So one of them was in the basement of this church, and it's called Refuge des Jeunes. And here they welcome 900 kids every month, and they give them a shower, a locker, and a bed for 2 weeks. And the third one was a huge villa called La Maison du Père, the house of the father, where they welcome entire families that can stay up to 3 months. So I started visiting the shelters and talking to the homeless. And they all told me the same thing. You know, we feel invisible. We go out in the street and ask for help, and no one sees us. They treat us like a garbage can or a lamp post. We are invisible. We do not exist. You want to help us? Make us visible. And before I gave an answer, they said, "But no photography, please. No photography. You know, we are very proud. We don't want to be photographed as homeless people. So talk about us without showing our faces. Make us visible without photographing us." I was very moved, and I felt it was a beautiful challenge. So I went back home to New York, and 3 months later, I came back with a project. And I asked them, please vote. If the majority of you approve this idea, we will do it. If not, we will not do it. You decide. They voted yes. Inside the cupola, we installed 100,000 watts of red lights in such a way that when the lights are on, the cupola becomes red for just 1 second, like this. And I connected this to a device installed inside the shelters. I'm going to now go inside the shelters, but I'm not going to show you a single homeless person. I'm respecting their privacy. So if you look at the sign on the right side, there's a photograph of the cupola and a text that explains my project, which is called Lumière dans la ville, lights in the city. And I tell them, if you want your presence to be known to the city, please press this button, and the cupola will go red. And so we had the same sign in the 3 shelters. So people come to have dinner and to dance, to have drinks, to party, and you can see the cupola from very far, 6 blocks around. And once in a while, the light goes red as a sign that another homeless person is entering another shelter. So we made the front pages of all the newspapers and magazines in Montreal, and the press descended on this area of the city to talk to the homeless that became suddenly human again. They were able to tell their stories, to give their names, to tell their stories about what happened to their lives, why they became homeless. A group of young homeless decided to stand the entire night seated around the sign, and they keep pushing it because they wanted the light to be on all the time. So, because of the success, all the other 12 shelters around the city wanted to join us and to be connected, to transform this tower into the tower of shame of the city. But the mayor said enough is enough, and he stopped the project. So I wanted to do a portrait of homelessness without showing faces. I wanted to respect their privacy and their dignity. But the red light also makes reference to the fire that destroyed this cupola 5 times in its history. But this time, it's not a fire that is destroying this tower. It's the fact that Canadian society allows for 15,000 people to go homeless every night. Light in the city, in Montreal. The EU, a few years ago, received the Nobel Peace Prize. Some people like me, some activists, were outraged that the EU had become a fortress against immigrants, and they were still receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. These are images from the EU in the last 2 years. These are images in Lampedusa, which has become an open-air prison. More than 20,000 refugees are waiting for a generous country in Europe to take them. And in another part of the island, life goes on, as if everything was normal. This is Helsinki, the capital of Finland. It's a very beautiful city. But in the last few years, these are the kind of images we find in the streets of Helsinki. There's a new neo-fascist party called the Finns, who wants to expel immigrants and close the borders and get out of the European Union. They have 20% of the votes. A few years before, I was invited to do a project in Helsinki, and I immediately noticed how homogeneous was Finnish society. So I immediately looked at the numbers, and I realized that Sweden, Denmark, and Norway had welcomed 1 million immigrants in the last 10 years. But Finland had welcomed 37 people. So, because Finland has a very insular mentality, because for 600 years they were conquered by the Russians and by the Swedes. So they resist the foreigners. But Finland also wanted to be part of the EU, the European community. So I thought this is a beautiful contradiction. On one hand, you want to become part of the larger community of Europe, and on the other hand, you're rejecting people from the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. So I decided to focus on this subject. I did a proposal that was refused by the Finnish immigration authorities. So I hired a lawyer, Matti Vuori. He's a human rights lawyer. At the time, he was president of Greenpeace International. And he helped me win my case in the court. And I was allowed to produce my project. It was titled 1 Million Finnish Passports. And that's exactly what we have here. Why 1 million? I had calculated that in most European countries, approximately 20% of the population is foreign or foreign descendant. So if Finland had a normal immigration policy like the rest of Europe, since they have 5 million inhabitants, they should have had now 1 million immigrants. These are the passports of those missing 1 million immigrants in Finland. The Finnish immigration authorities asked me to display the passport behind high security glass, so people could not take them. I accepted. And in the contract, they asked me to burn the passport after the exhibition, and I was not allowed to film or to photograph the burning of the passports. I accepted because these were the conditions to do the project. So with this project, I wanted to ask the people of Finland, do you want to remain insular, or do you want to welcome new ideas, new faces, new sounds, new colors? The project was very controversial, and it created a lot of discussion, public discussions in the media about the insularity of Finland. And there were discussions, TV programs, interviews, and for 3 months people discussed the status of foreigners in Finland. This was my objective, to trigger a discussion. So my objective was accomplished, but the most beautiful reaction was a young man came in the morning to see the exhibition. He was moved, so he went to his home and came back in the afternoon and threw his own passport on the top of the pile as a sign of solidarity with immigrants. After the exhibition, because of my contract, I had to burn the passport, and I could not photograph the burning or film the burning. But I managed to steal 200 passports, and I still don't know what to do with them. 1 million Finnish passports in Helsinki. This image I've shown you repeatedly was shown in the entire world press. It was, of course, the image of this 3-year-old Syrian kid of Kurdish origin. His name was Alan Kurdi. That was photographed dead on this beach. And it made the front pages of all newspapers around the world. Suddenly, the Syrian crisis had an image and could not be ignored anymore by Europe and the world. This kid was coming from Kobani. Kobani is a small Kurdish city in Syria. He died, his mother died, his brother died. Hundreds of people died in that boat. The only survivor was the father, who is standing here in front of his home. All Kobani is destroyed. And not only Kobani, all Syria is destroyed. That is why we have 6 million refugees from Syria searching for a home around the world. Of the 6 million refugees from Syria, 3 million are in a refugee camp in Turkey, and 2 million are in refugee camp in Lebanon and in Jordan. So those 3 countries have accepted 5 million people. But there was 1 extra million, and that's the million that came to Europe and was rejected by Europe. That million represented 0.00001% of the European population. But still, it was rejected. This extraordinary image, and as you know, I'm interested in what I call the politics of images. I wanted to understand the origin of that image. And I discovered that it was a photograph taken by this young photojournalist from Istanbul. Her name is Nilüfer Demir. And so she took that image and sent it to a photo agency. But this was the original image. There are two policemen, the kid, there are two fishermen in the back, there's a car, there's a road, there's a little sky. That was the image that went to a photo agency in London. And so that morning, the editor of The Independent, a London newspaper, saw it and thought, this is interesting, but I need to change it. This is what he did. And he put it on the cover. Somebody's child, it says. And thanks to the new technologies and the internet, that image became viral. And it came out, one of the 5 images from the sequence, in more than 5,000 newspapers around the world. The Syrian crisis and the refugee crisis had been going on for years. Nobody cared. And suddenly this image captured the imagination, and it was reproduced everywhere. And it started changing minds. For example, the Daily Mirror, who is a very racist newspaper against immigrants, they put it on the cover and said unbearable. This is the Daily Mirror a few weeks before. Send in the dogs, they said. A month before. That is the power of images. The Daily Mail, another racist newspaper based in London, they put it on the cover. This is what the Daily Mail was saying just before. Migrants, how many more can we take, they ask. Le Monde did something that they had never done. They had an editorial on the cover of the magazine and the image printed in color. Open Your Eyes is the title of the editorial. Libération decided to put a different image on the cover with the word act, but they dedicated 6 pages to the crisis and 2 pages to analyze this image, and an editorial in the next page. La Stampa from Torino had an extraordinary poetic essay by Mario Calabresi. La spiaggia su cui muore l'Europa. Non l'immigrante, l'Europa. And of course, it went viral on internet, on the Twitter and Instagram and TikTok, etc. I just brought just a few selections to show you what it looks like. You are so lucky, Island. We are victims of the same war, but nobody cared about our death. This is a sculpture by an Indian sculptor. Humanity washed ashore. Shame, shame, shame. This is a performance group in Morocco. This is an homage in the Gaza Strip in occupied Palestine. An homage by very young kids of the same age of Alan Kurdi. This is a mural in Frankfurt, Germany. Another mural in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This is a gallery in Helsinki. And this is Mr. Ai Weiwei, repeating the same position of Alan Kurdi. He was brutally attacked for this gesture. They asked him, Mr. Weiwei, do you know that more than 175 people have died after Alan Kurdi on the same church? I became obsessed with this image and I thought, there must be something I can do with it. So I managed to, with Photoshop, we eliminated the body and the people. And we went back to the original beach, as it should be, without a dead body. And with this image, we created a box. And the work was called The Gift. We produced 12,000 blue boxes. And we went to Basel, one of the richest cities of Europe, during the art fair. And we had 37 volunteers that distributed this box to people. And they simply said, may I offer you a gift? And when you open the box, it says, warning, this gift can change you. And at the bottom it says, please disassemble this box completely and reassemble it inside out. So that means that once you do that, then the blue goes inside and the beach goes outside. And so it becomes an artwork as a memory of that moment and that place of tragedy. But at the bottom, I had information about MOAS. MOAS is an extraordinary non-profit organization. It means Migrant Offshore Aid Station. And so I was telling people, we'll give you this gift, but please help MOAS. MOAS uses drones, but not killer drones, not drones that kill innocent people around the world. As you know, more than 6,000 people have been killed by drones. Innocent people, men, women, children, people with no names. And these killer drones are directed from Florida or Las Vegas. And it's totally illegal. No, these are not the drones that MOAS is using. MOAS is using drone, and they survey the Mediterranean Sea. And when they see a boat in distress, they send a signal to Rome, and Rome gives them the permission to intervene. And only then they can do it. Because European law does not let you help a boat of immigrants in the Mediterranean if the boat is not in distress. You have to wait for the boat to start sinking. Only then it is legal for you to help them. That's a criminal law. Anyway, we distributed the boxes. We raised almost 1 million euros. So to help save more lives. But more than the money, I was interested in having this dialogue with the citizen of Switzerland's richest city. And so the volunteers, sometimes they could spend 30 minutes with one person before giving them the box to explain the concept of the project. We were forbidden to enter inside the fair, but we managed to go in. And of course, it was the only free thing inside the fair. We were approached by another NGO, Italian NGO, that is working on the Adriatic Sea, where a lot of immigrants and a lot of bodies are also washing down. And so they invited us to recreate the project for them over there, and so we did it. The gift. We put him to sleep, and it's about time for us to wake up, says this tweet. So Europe keep putting fences, and refugees keep dying. Governments around Europe were absolutely despicable. But the people, mostly of the south of Europe, were extremely generous. I'm thinking about Greece, the south of Italy, Spain, Portugal. There are so many beautiful stories. This is a baker from Athens that closed his shop and he came down to Lesbos to make bread to welcome the refugees. And there are so many stories like this one. Finally, one European leader, Angela Merkel from Germany, changed her mind and decided to open the doors of Germany. And Germany welcomed almost 1 million immigrants. That was the only country that opened their doors officially. But for every beautiful gesture, we had this kind of gestures, because a neo-fascist movement is taking over Europe. This is in Poland. And sadly, it's not only Poland that has become fascist. everywhere parties are surging, emerging in most European capitals with a neo-fascist ideology. And we have prime ministers like, we will see them now. This statement by Gramsci, I did a project in Rome where I put these posters all around. And Gramsci wrote this in the 30s, and it has become so prescient, so actual, so present. This is another fascist prime minister. This is Orban from Hungary. Hungary should be expelled from Europe. This is Austria. This is Germany. This is Sweden. This is Denmark. Denmark started stealing everything that the refugees had in their pockets, even their wedding rings. The Czech Republic, Holland, France, Italy, the UK, Israel, even the Nobel Peace Prize, Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma has expelled almost 1 million Rohingyas that are living now in Bangladesh. And Australia has set up 2 refugee camps in 2 islands called Manus and Nauru. They don't want even the refugees to touch Australian soil. It is really a scandal. In the United States, where I live, there are more than 1,200 hate groups that are official and legal. And during the last administration, parents were separated from their kids at the border and sent back. And the kids were put in cages around the United States. More than 70,000 children were separated from their kids, babies. This was official US policy during the Trump regime. What kind of monsters put children in cages? Canada was an exception. Canada welcomed refugees, and they wanted more and more. This is Trudeau, the Prime Minister, who is here in the airport welcoming a Syrian family. He is here taking a selfie with another group of refugees. He even nominated Ahmed Hussein, who is a former refugee, as a Minister of Immigration of Canada. And Canada is connected to the story of Alan Kurdi because his aunt, Tina Kurdi, lives in Canada. And she was hoping to bring all of them into Canada. So this is the rest of the family that finally came into Canada, a month later, after the death of Alan Kurdi and his brother and his mother. I will end this presentation with the Rio Olympics, not the Beijing Olympics, but the Rio Olympics that took place in the summer. It was a very beautiful spectacle. The entire world watched via television, internet, the Olympics. And Brazil did a marvelous spectacle I'm not interested in sports, but I was interested in this particular Olympics because of this. The first day of the Olympics in Rio, there is a march into the stadium, into the Olympic stadium, by all the countries. And I was watching that moment. This is when Angola arrived, and then Canada, and Brazil, Japan, Burundi. And this is the moment I was waiting for. This was a small team that did not belong to any country. Because of the refugee crisis, the Olympic Committee had decided to invite a group of refugees from different countries around the world. And it was called the Olympic Team of Refugees. And this is when they enter the stadium. They were so happy to be there. They had survived a perilous journey through the seas that took months, sometimes years, to survive and to arrive to another country, and were able to train and actually compete in the Olympics as refugees. Each one of these refugees has an extraordinary story. And of course, there is no time to tell the story of all of them. I want to share with you just one story of her. Her name is Yusra Mardini, and she's a swimmer from Syria. Yusra was living in Damascus in Syria, and a village was destroyed, and she had to flee. And she fled with her sister, Sarah. And she arrived in Beirut, Lebanon. They offered her a refugee camp. She said no. And she continued to Izmir in Turkey. Turkey also offered her home inside a refugee camp. She said no. And continued and reached the sea. And they took a little boat with 28 other people to try to reach Sweden. In the middle of their journey, their boat started sinking, and they were all going to die. But Yusra thought, I am a swimmer. I am not going to die in the water. So she jumped into the water with her sister Sarah and 3 strong men, and they started pushing the boat and swimming with their feet. And they did this for 5 hours, and they managed to reach Lesbos in Greece, and they were saved. Greece offered Yusra a refugee camp. She said no. And she went to Macedonia. And from Macedonia, she reached Belgrade in Serbia. And from there, she continued and reached Budapest, who is building fences all around. She managed to go in, and after, she managed to get out, and she reached Vienna. And finally, from Vienna, she continued her journey, and she reached Berlin. Her journey lasted 1 year. And she arrived in Berlin the same day that this image of Alan Kurdi was published in the newspapers. The same day. She was so happy to be in the Olympics. She was a little star. Everyone wanted to interview her. And in one interview, the journalist asked her, Yusra, what would you like to say to the other refugees that are watching you from around the world? What could you say to them? And she said, never give up. And she repeated again, never give up. Never give up. I would like to dedicate this presentation to a friend of mine who is a very good friend of the Fondazione Merz. This is a work of his placed on the tip of a wave. Thank you.
Direi che grazie infinito per questa splendida conferenza, densa di temi, di strategie dell'immagine. Direi di dare subito inizio al dialogo tra Danilo Eccher e Alfredo Jaar. Credo che, no, appunto, possiamo avviarlo fin da subito poi.
Ma in realtà credo che intervenire dopo questa lezione di Alfredo sia una cosa piuttosto difficile, cioè avviare un dialogo dopo una presentazione così intensa, così forte, così emozionale, così drammatica, francamente non saprei proprio da cosa iniziare. Io mi ero preparato una scaletta totalmente diversa che ho stracciato già dopo le prime 5 parole di Alfredo e quindi tutta la mia scaletta non ha senso. Io voglio solo, anche perché l'ora è tarda, quindi io voglio essere molto breve e lasciare magari la parola a voi. Dico solo 2 cose, faccio una considerazione e una domanda ad Alfredo. La considerazione è quando qualcuno ci chiede, e a noi insomma che lavoriamo nel mondo dell'arte viene chiesto spesso a cosa serve l'arte. Ecco, io credo che Alfredo abbia questa sera dato una risposta meravigliosa. L'arte serve a questo, cioè serve a rimettere in moto il pensiero, le emozioni, le sensazioni. Ecco, l'arte serve a questo. Quando davvero ci si chiede perché non si lavora con l'arte, non si guadagna con l'arte, non si mangia con l'arte, c'era un ministro che diceva questo, e io lo manderei davvero a fare una piccola lezione da Alfredo per capire veramente a cosa serve l'arte. Questa è la mia prima considerazione. La domanda invece è un po' più tecnica, nel senso che Alfredo, come voi avrete perfettamente capito, lavora su un concetto di arte estremamente forte e soprattutto un'arte che interagisce e integra vari linguaggi. La letteratura, la poesia, la sociologia, cioè lavora su un crinale estremamente complesso di linguaggi, intersecando molti saperi. E proprio questo intreccio di relazioni fra saperi, conoscenze, linguaggi artistici, emozioni, crea un'arte che è molto forte, molto drammatica. Io l'ho invitato, e per questo l'ho invitato, a una mostra che si chiama Crazy, che è quasi l'opposto. Cioè una mostra sulla vivacità, sulla gioia, sulla felicità, è una mostra che tocca i tasti dello spettacolo, della teatralità, della partecipazione, qualcosa di distante, no? Dal lavoro tradizionale di Alfredo. Io infatti ho invitato Alfredo proprio per questo, perché mi serviva una sorta di ancora. E infatti non ho preso un'opera, ho preso una serie, ho chiesto ad Alfredo che mi ha dato una serie di pensieri, una serie di suggerimenti, una serie di piccole frasi, piccoli suggerimenti che in qualche modo trattengono questa leggerezza del racconto della mostra. E io vorrei, questo è il motivo per il quale ho invitato Alfredo. L'ho invitato per ridarmi quella profondità che forse altrimenti la narrazione espositiva poteva forse perdere. E questo è quello che io ho chiesto a lui, è quello che io sento che in questa mostra lui ha dato. E io vorrei chiedere però ad Alfredo come si è sentito a entrare in una mostra che invece giocava sulla leggerezza, giocava sulla gioia, giocava su timbri, toni, colori diversi.
It was difficult. It was very difficult because I'm not a happy man. I'm more a depressing type of character. So I normally don't do happy exhibitions. So for me it was a challenge. And yes, I felt that sometimes my work was there required to bring some kind of gravitas to the scene. And I think in some cases we managed that, and I'm very pleased. When my modest little phrase would celebrate the genius of one artist or another. So in certain cases, I think it worked very well. In other cases, I think I was lost in the middle of the craziness. But what is important for me was not that I was not pretending to be crazy. I was really reflecting and quoting other people whose craziness was extraordinary. So when I was thinking, for example, in the Divine Comedy from Dante, that's the most crazy, extraordinary work ever done. So I'm just quoting Dante, but it's really Dante who is present in the show, not me. And the same with other works of that kind. So I was a kind of conduit from geniuses of literature and poetry and so on, bringing a little gravitas into this happy project. So it was a beautiful experience. I do not regret it. I'm very happy to have taken this journey with Danilo.
Intanto questo è il fatto che lui abbia colto questo aspetto, ovviamente mi fa molto piacere, perché era uno dei temi che mi mettevano un po' in ansia nella realizzazione, nell'invito di Alfredo. Però c'è un'altra cosa che io vorrei sottolineare e poi lascio la parola a voi, ma solo per mettere alcuni punti fondamentali. Uno degli elementi che io ho sempre trovato estremamente importanti nel lavoro di Alfredo, che non è in tantissimi lavori di artisti contemporanei, anzi forse lo è stato fino agli anni 60-70, poi si è un po' persa questa idea che l'arte in qualche modo andasse a intrecciare, a in qualche modo assimilarsi alla politica, alla letteratura, alla filosofia, cioè il fatto che l'arte si mettesse in gioco, si mettesse in mostra e in qualche modo non solo dialogasse, ma creasse una sorta di intreccio con gli altri saperi, è una delle cose che a mio parere, e vorrei sapere cosa ne pensa Alfredo, a mio parere si è persa. Sono pochissimi gli artisti che oggi lavorano consapevolmente con questo grande intreccio e questo grande patrimonio culturale, no? Questa mostra, per esempio, in tuo intervento l'hai dedicato a Lawrence Wiener, che è un altro grande artista che ha saputo lavorare non solo sul linguaggio, ma anche proprio sulla relazione tra il linguaggio, il pensiero, la filosofia e la letteratura. È una cosa che si è un po' persa, si sta un po' perdendo. No? Alfredo è uno di quelli che ancora ha la capacità, la forza di tenere insieme e anzi di invitare a ricreare questo legame fra i vari saperi, fra i vari linguaggi. Negli anni 60, per esempio, era normale che un attore conoscesse i pittori, frequentasse i pittori, che un ballerino conoscesse il cinema e via dicendo. Oggi queste arti si stanno sempre più separando, stanno più sempre abbandonandoli. E quindi il fatto di avere ancora questa capacità di unire questi linguaggi credo che sia estremamente importante, no?
Sì, I agree with you. And this is, in my case, coming from architecture. Architects are curious. Artists wear these things like horses and they look straight. Architects have open eyes and they need to understand the context. So they're curious, they're interested in everything. So I use the methodology of the architect, and it's my curiosity that moves me. And that's why I'm interested in all these geniuses in different fields of knowledge and culture. It's the world, it's architecture that made me. And so I really thank architecture for being the way I am. And everything I know, everything I learned, I have being an architect and being an artist as an architect.
Se posso aggiungere una cosa prima di dare...
Assolutamente.
No, che forse pensavo alla domanda che hai fatto proprio della tua mostra e alla presentazione che adesso Alfredo Jaar ci ha proposto. Come dire, nella tua mostra c'era, e forse anche nel tipo di inseminazione che Alfredo ha proposto, c'è l'idea di un ordine guidato, ma non preciso dell'inseminazione dei messaggi. Cioè in realtà la mostra propone, come dire, l'idea di una follia che è essenzialmente una inseminazione semantica progressiva, e questa è la gioia. Il riferimento a Gramsci nell'ultima parte indicava anche esattamente, come dire, che non è che non è prevedibile dove, come dire, l'insieme di segni, immagini, denunce accorate, dolori vadano, come dire, a comporsi in un luogo topico, no? Però indubbiamente dietro questo, come dire, c'è un po' quell'elemento evangelico, la grazia del Signore vuole dove vuole, cioè c'è un coagulo che è a valle, a monte, e che in fondo è come dire, è quel vento che spira nel deserto, no? E di cui Giona non sa, no? Ma è quel ventolino che alla fine lui dice: questo è il Signore, no? Questa cosa qua che sta al di sotto di qui, e che non parla nella superficie delle cose, no? Ma è quello che le ricombina, credo. Non so se sia un'osservazione pertinente, ma...
Sì.
Bene, grazie. Sono domande? No, sì.
Sì, forse magari qualcuno è interessato ad affrontare qualche quesito. Io avrei un'ultima domanda, ma poi magari solo per rompere un po' il ghiaccio con voi. E la facevo ancora ad Alfredo perché giustamente Alfredo mi ha ricordato una cosa che io ho trascurato e che invece è fondamentale. Lui l'ha ribadito 2 o 3 volte, ma io lo do per scontato e non ci penso. E lui è un architetto e ha una dimensione dello spazio straordinario. Per me, cioè per chi poi va a curare una mostra, il concetto di spazio è un concetto determinante, perché le mostre si fanno come i vestiti su misura, si fanno sullo spazio. E credo di aver visto pochi artisti che leggono lo spazio con una velocità, con un'immediatezza come Alfredo. E quando abbiamo fatto il percorso per scegliere dove mettere le opere, cioè non c'è stato dal suo punto di vista un momento di pausa, un momento di dubbio, un momento di perplessità. Ecco, io vorrei che lui magari ci dicesse qualche cosa sull'importanza dello spazio in relazione al tuo lavoro. quanto lo spazio incide nella scelta e nella progettualità del tuo lavoro.
Well, because I respond to the context, and context is everything, every work is site-specific for space. So it belongs to that space and nowhere else. So it is designed for that space and it is placed in that particular space. And for me, for an architect, a space is not a physical thing. It's not 10 meters by 4 meters and by 20 meters. No. A space is a political space, is a cultural space, it's a social space. It is a space of knowledge, of information. And so when you design a work, you have to dialogue with that space. You're not putting it anywhere in the desert. You're putting in that specific space with a history. So that's what architects do. And we are aware that we are contributing to the meaning and we are changing the meaning of that space. And so it becomes very natural to me. And when I'm invited to do an exhibition or when I'm invited to send a work somewhere, I don't do it. I need to see the space. I need to understand where it is going to be and who is the artist next to me and in front of me. All these things are of meaning. It's not arbitrary. To see a work of an artist next to another work, the meaning changes and the space changes. So I always demand this kind of awareness to my students, that nothing is arbitrary. Everything can be explained. Everything can be researched. Everything can be thought. And space is just one of the elements that are part of what we do. So we don't do things. We do things in a space. And that changes the space, and that changes the thing.
Magnifico, grazie. Io direi che è opportuno a questo punto che la parola a chi vuole proporre delle domande, Alfredo Jaar o anche a Danilo Eccher naturalmente, o intervenire nel dialogo tra i due. Ci sono domande?
Allora credo che possiamo ringraziare prima di tutto Alfredo, che è stato veramente eccezionale questa sera, ringraziare il professor Vercellone che ha organizzato e che ha dato vita a questa iniziativa, e ovviamente a tutti voi che avete pazientato fino a quest'ora. Grazie mille.
Grazie mille a tutti, grazie a Fondazione Merz, grazie alla Fondazione.